Hello everyone, here is the lecture for Thursday, April 2nd. There's one more lecture after this. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit shorter today. I gave you 2 full hours last week, which was more than I intended. I got carried away. I'll try and keep it short. Two quick notices though. Um, I'm about to post. I haven't done it yet, but I probably will have by the time you're actually watching this. The instructions for the final project. Of course, you're not making an object anymore, and I posted details of what we are expecting. They are, understandably and for good reason, a lot looser than they might otherwise have been, but we're still hoping that you're going to get something out of this, which means kind of putting some effort in where possible. And of course, we understand that these are strange times and difficult circumstances, especially if you're working in an environment where it's not necessarily very conducive to work if you're in a busy household, as I am. So we totally get it. So try your best, do as well as you possibly can. No one is going to be allowed to fail this course because of what happened, because of the way that they turn out this project. If you put in good effort, you'll do well. Okay. Final thing to comment on is about the bonus assignment. If you haven't yet emailed me showing interest in that, please email me right away. I will be sending out the email with the details of what the bonus assignment consists of in the next week or less, if I can manage it. Okay, right. So today we are continuing the post-industrial revolution, but now we're really getting into the 20th century in terms of design. Last week I set up the story sort of in that 19th century sense, especially the descending from William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Of course, we're still very much in that, in the wake of that, as we discussed last week. I also try to give you some of this background of beauty. Now that's where I kind of went off, and I meant that lecture to only be about 15-20 minutes. It got a bit out of hand. As you can tell, I think that's where I have a great deal of interest. What I wanted you to really take out of that was this idea that art got carried away. Art meaning painting, really, but painting and sculpture. And then things that grew out of sculpture, like landscape art, and then subsequently conceptual art. A whole lot of very interesting things, which we don't have time to really get into right now. Um, uh, Beauty was not a part of that equation. Uh, the artists whom I talked about last week, kind of basically starting with Picasso, I went as far as Andy Warhol, but even more importantly, those continuing after Warhol in the 70s into conceptual art in the 70s and even into the 80s. Beauty was not really part of the equation. Sometimes it appeared, uh, perhaps accidentally, sometimes somewhat on purpose, but that really wasn't the main point of it. Beauty was completely out of the picture. Ultimately, the question for them was, well, what would beauty even look like? Whose beauty? They were rebelling against this notion that there was even such a thing as beauty. Beauty required a central point, an absolute someone who could say, yes, this is absolutely beautiful. In the old days, there were the church could do that. Then subsequently, there were kind of subjective values that were made objective and generalized, and people could talk about beauty in some kind of general absolute sense. But through the 20th century, artists were pushing against that and rebelling against that idea that you could have such a thing as a notion of an absolute sense of what beauty is. There we go. Everyone's having problems on the... Should be okay. Um, uh, so what I was arguing, or what I was beginning to, maybe not argue, what I was beginning to think about was that design picks up where beauty leaves off as far as, where art leaves off as far as beauty is concerned, that design has a capacity for and an interest in beauty that art decides to not worry about through through at least most of the 20th century, if not all of the 20th century, and even still today. Anyway, let's look at what I'm talking about. So I introduced all of these ideas as kind of being the background, the cultural background to the era beginning in the 20th century, and this era of massive shifts. And I really want to focus on one particular artist just for a moment in order to then depart into design properly. Um, who was responding very directly to the science and the mathematical, kind of geometrical mathematical approach to the world that came into being in the end of the 19th century, and then kind of came to define the 20th century. And by mathematics, I don't necessarily just mean sitting down and doing sums and numbers. What I mean is a rationalizing way of industrializing things, of making, and I should say mechanizing rather than industrializing, mechanizing things. So that warfare was my example last week, gets mechanized, but lots of things get mechanized. And you can make an argument that the new layout for Paris that Baron Haussmann developed in the 1850s, and we'll talk about that some other time. Look it up if you're interested in pursuing that, or email me if you want more notes on that. You could argue that that was a mechanization of a city. And so this artist that I wanted to introduce, you may be familiar with, is Mondrian. Mondrian was a Dutch artist, very much pursuing the same kinds of questions that people like Picasso and Braque and their other colleague Juan Gris were pursuing, basically in the wake of Cézanne, trying to figure out what looking actually looked like. And so his paintings, his early paintings, he has earlier paintings that are much more sort of realistic, but I wanted these early successful experiments in playing with vision look like this. And look at this one on the right here, where the shapes of the world are being dissolved into squares and geometric sense, this mechanization that I'm talking about. Once he really had developed his idea, his paintings end up looking more like this, and it's this style on the right that we're very familiar with. What we should take from Mondrian, and there's many things we could take from Mondrian, but what we should emphasize is his wrestling with this idea of geometricization, the making, the pressing of geometry into our world, and our finding geometries in our world, looking at straight lines, and finding straight lines, I should say, and seeing how they define our world. Now, what is, as I say, there's many things that are important about Mondrian, but what I really also want to emphasize is the movement that he was part of, or sort of defined with his colleague painter Theo van Doesburg, and the movement was called De Stijl. Style was the name of the movement, Dutch movement, De Stijl, and the movement, it was an abstract. As you can see, they were looking for this abstracted view of the world. There was really a reaction against the Art Deco, Art Nouveau, arts and crafts. Arts and crafts was slightly too early for them to be rejecting that. They were really rejecting Art Nouveau and Art Deco, this excess and overdoing they felt. But what's important to keep in mind is that they also felt that there was something sort of spiritual within viewing the world like this. Mondrian in particular was something called a theosophist, and don't worry about that. But he had there was a spiritualist understanding of the world that got away from rationality in a sense, and relied on a sort of spiritualism, pre-religious kind of spiritualism. And this is odd, because he was at the same time looking at the world in this kind of hyper-rationalized way, or maybe looking at a hyper-rationalized world and trying to understand it, and trying to see some kind of sort of abstracted spiritual truths within these forms. And I want you to sort of think about paintings like this one, like tableau number 1 here on the right, in the same context as the Vitruvian Man. There was Leonardo da Vinci trying to fit human beings into the equation. Actually, just hang on one second. Okay, there we are. I just added that slide in right now. Just to make the point there that what Leonardo da Vinci was trying to do is very similar to what Mondrian was trying to do, was trying to understand the entire universe, basically, but certainly this sort of the abstract sense of the totality of everything, from, on the one hand, hyper-rationalized, abstracted geometrical senses. Both of them are doing here. Leonardo da Vinci with his square and the circle and the human inside it. Mondrian with his straight lines, this kind of organized sense. But at the same time, doing it in an environment for Leonardo da Vinci that was more just sort of his contextual social environment. For Mondrian, it was kind of a personal environment of this kind of religious spiritual sense. How do we fit these two things together, spiritualism and rationalism? And this is an important theme because, and here's the kicker, the style that Mondrian developed and the movement he was part of, de style, becomes highly influential for design that leads directly from Van Doesburg and from Mondrian himself. De Style's approach, embodied both in Mondrian and Van Doesburg, was to take this idea of looking at the world through this sort of straight lines and this reduced abstraction, and it was of great influence to designers after this, especially and predominantly through the Bauhaus, which is what we will get to in a few minutes here, and more broadly in architecture, the international style, which is what we're about to talk about. Van Doesburg and Mondrian himself, but especially Van Doesburg, although they were painters, they also made furniture, and this is, of course, no coincidence and an important part of the story. So what we're thinking about when we're combining the ideas of the kind of industrial period and coming out of this new era of design. I brought the Crystal Palace back one last time to remind us of this new era of design embodied by the Great Exhibition, but housed in a building. And this is what I want to now depart from. Housed in a building that represented this new era, this new way of making, this new way of dealing with materials that was at once honest and pure in the sense that Gord was talking about 2 weeks ago. The use of iron and steel and glass without pretending that there's something else, and then using them in innovative ways that responded to the industrial the developments of the Industrial Revolution in a positive and an advanced and interesting way, taking along with it the sorts of questions and attempts at answers that we can see embodied in the work of Mondrian and Van Doesburg, as I was just talking about. So let's talk about architecture just for a few minutes. Architecture and design are very closely related. I mean, that's a silly thing to say. Much of architecture is design. But even when we're talking about industrial design and design of more discrete objects, smaller objects, the connection is still very strong. And so a lot that has been written and studied and discussed and theorized in the world of design has come from architecture, or vice versa, and there's been a great deal of exchange. So look at the Crystal Palace here in the 1851, and at about exactly the same time, here's this building, built in Paris, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, which is still there. You can go and visit it. It is an iron building, wrought iron supported building that no one believed would stand up. There were some concerns about its architecture, but it was just fine. It actually did need some small repairs after it was finished, but it worked very well. And here you can see how amazing it would be for people to see the narrowness of these columns. Without meaning too much to evoke the conversations about Romanesque and Gothic, it's hard not to. And considering that there was a neo-Gothic revival going on, especially in Britain, but in France as well, it's no surprise that we end up with applications of this new technology like this, where you can see advances and you can see how it moves forward. This use of metal in this honest, kind of frank way became a defining characteristic, and in fact it's so defining a characteristic that it impacts building structures. If we were in our lecture hall at Sheridan, I would certainly point to the way that the building is constructed around us. One of the first places it's used to build a tall building, and this is the important thing, is 1864. So what we have now is the beginning, the development of this new kind of construction, what we will subsequently think of as steel I-beam construction, metal core skeleton that then the facade hangs from. So here we still have a stone facade being hung on the front of an iron building, but behind that stone facade is the same kind of building that you might recognize as a glass and steel sort of building of a downtown anywhere in especially North America, and now increasingly other parts of the world as well, of course. Um, One of the big developments, a side note I have to make here, something that was introduced after but in connection to the Great Exhibition, is this little contraption. Sure, elevators had existed before, but they were generally somewhat unsafe, largely because if the ropes or even chains that were holding up the platform broke, the thing would fall and everything inside would be damaged, and any human beings inside would most likely be killed. What Otis developed, what Elisha Otis managed to develop, was a braking mechanism. That was the big contribution. His elevators were highly successful, and he showed his example was he got in one of his own elevators and had the ropes cut, and although the elevator fell a few feet, it didn't fall at all significantly. The result, the combination of these two features takes us to today. Elevators mean you can build tall buildings, and the technology of this steel frame construction, what now we would recognize as this, you can see it all around. There's a building going up in Oakville, just north of the train station. Every time I come in, I see a new stage of its development, and it's absolutely sort of textbook. It's lovely to see, and if we were there, I might even suggest we walk down there to have a look at it. But anyway, you know what it looks like. It looks very much like this, and this is how we get something like this, of course. Manhattan is perhaps the primo example, but you can look everywhere around the world for buildings and areas like this allowed for because of these two developments, these two responses, these two modes of using these industrial processes. Just as sort of a side note, it's important that the elevator is so important, is because if you have a building that's much more than sort of 4 or 5 stories, you can't expect people to get there walking the stairs. That's not a comment on laziness. That's just a real practicality. The higher the building, the more the need for stairs. And once you reach a certain threshold, that you need to be able to get people up and down faster and with more ease. And of course, elevators become essential. Whether that's 5 floors or 10 floors, the elevator is a big part of that. So anyway, it sounds like I've gone very far from Mondrian and de Stijl, but I haven't really, and I hope you'll see how it comes back later. Also, if you know Mondrian, you'll know that he painted pictures of exactly this in his later years. There is one of those paintings called Broadway Boogie Woogie from 1942, 43-ish, in which he tried to capture some of the frenetic energy of Manhattan, perhaps as it's sort of obvious or is suggested, it kind of looks like looking down on streets from a skyscraper. And although I think that's not necessarily the best way to read Mondrian, I think we should think of him as more abstract a painter than that. It's very difficult to get away from that feeling of the ordered streets, as in a city like Manhattan or Chicago, and the energy of vehicles and life below. When looked at from a high building, if you've had that opportunity to look from a skyscraper down into a city below, there is this feeling of removed, abstracted energy that Mondrian was trying to capture. So the themes are continuing, even as we continue to talk about architecture. What happens with this technology, these steel beams, and the possibilities for making higher and higher buildings, it gets very exciting. And so we can't talk about this without talking about Sullivan and Adler, a company represent two people, Louis Sullivan and Dagmar Adler, from the end of the 19th century through into the early 20th century, begin developing the kinds of buildings that then become skyscrapers. They built a very famous building in Chicago called the Auditorium Building, which had remarkable mechanics for moving the stage and moving the chairs around. And they also built this interesting building in Buffalo. If you ever have a chance to be in Buffalo, try and have a look at this building. Now here's some detail here. What you'll see here is that this is much too arts and craftsy than the coming modernist movement would allow for. Look at this decoration up here on, this is a detail of the building you're looking at on the left. There's still a huge influence of the arts and crafts in this, both in terms of material and in terms of stylistic choices. But the building itself is constructed in a way that will become modernism. And what it took was one of their proteges to really take the next step. Now, the next step was not necessarily the final step, and that's how these sorts of things go. But it was a very profound step in a new direction, and that person was Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright must be loved by the craft and design community for his various ways of playing with the ideas inherited from the arts and crafts movement. Some things that he certainly agreed with and lined up with, especially in use of materials, in honesty, in a building doing what it proclaims to do, trying to be both useful and beautiful, perhaps might be a way of thinking about it. But he also went in different directions. Ornament was to be stripped right down and to be simplified, and to be very much more in keeping with the sort of Mondrian van Doesburg way of thinking, a simplified, a universalist kind of abstraction. So he designed a building like this that was meant to be practically useful for the people working in it. He interviewed the organization that was going to work actually and use this building when it was completed, before he even really started designing it. And so the design, this main hall where I think it was the sort of the main receptionist sat, or sort of administrative people, they wouldn't be called administrative assistants, but kind of important frontline people, so that they could communicate easily with each other, was the important feature, whilst communicating with clients and whatever else was going on in there. Point is, Frank Lloyd Wright knew that the way the building was going to be used was going to be an important part of his design, and this is a very important principle that isn't necessarily a modernist principle, but it is a Frank Lloyd Wright principle, and of course it's a William Morris principle. So it's important to see that carried through as we move into this new sign. So here are just a couple of points. I stole this slide from a different lecture I gave on architecture, so I just wanted to include that because I felt that it was important to mention what for an architecture point of view would be important. This idea of shared attitudes with the Europeans, those Europeans especially being engaged with the steel movement, and this balance of function and beauty or design, and these horizontals and verticals, which we're about to get to. Frank Lloyd Wright, oh, there we are, that's fancy. Frank Lloyd Wright loved his horizontals, and he developed the style that he's most famous for, that has been called the Prairie style. This is the Roby House in Chicago, where you have cantilevered spaces. This roof here is cantilevered, meaning it leans way out with no support. And of course, the support is provided internally, and that's a sort of a design, a functional design risk that really pays off if it works. And of course, it did work. The house is remarkable and very beautiful, and you can see why it was important to mention horizontals and verticals. The idea of orderliness, I hope you can see, looking at either of these pictures, how it's a little bit like looking at a Mondrian painting turned into a three-dimensional interior or structure, something you can be inside, and that is very much what's going on here. There are other influences. Again, look at these chairs. An argument could be made that the chairs fit into an arts and crafts history, although they are very much now part of this new move towards something that we're going to end up calling modernist. Here's another, perhaps the most famous Frank Lloyd Wright house. It's in Pennsylvania. Again, if you're driving through the States, definitely make a point of stopping there. I've never actually been, but I know a lot of people who have, and no one has ever said that they were disappointed. Whatever their interests are, people who don't care about architecture at all go, and they're blown away, and people who love architecture go, and they're blown away. It was built for a client, built into the rock face. the rock you can see here with the waterfall. The water starts up here. It actually flows sort of under and through the house, and this was important for the client, and of course very important for the designer. Look what he's done here. He's taken this sort of rigid, geometric, abstract. You could use the word mechanized, orderly horizontals and verticals, using materials that are both natural, stone, and brought in, clearly man-made. The concrete use here, and of course there's a lot of steel back inside, allowing for this cantilevered effect. And the rock becomes part of the house. This is added flooring, but here you can see the actual rock face. This is the rock that is in the hillside, built into the house. Now that is awesome. You know, oops, that's very cool, and you can still see. Again, look at that in comparison to a Van Doesburg painting. The gouache that I just showed you a few slides back. Look at that. I mean, that's again the painting made flesh. These crazy cantilevered balconies and whatnot. A beautiful, beautiful house. Great example of Frank Lloyd Wright, and an interesting step towards a modernism, the kind of modernism that we associate with American design. But as you just saw, let's go back to Europe before we go any further. Bauhaus. How long have I been going? Okay, this is good. We're going to talk about Bauhaus for a few minutes here, and that's going to be our main purpose here. The Bauhaus was a school, and it was a school that operated from 1919 until 1933, which in some senses is quite a long time if we think of Bauhaus as a movement, as a creative design movement, but it's not really a very long time if you think of the Bauhaus as a school or university or something, an institution that has a strong defining mandate, but is still a place where people actually go to learn things and then come out in the world and make stuff and have an influence on things. So, you know, it is both of those things. The Bauhaus is a movement, is a design movement that, of course, originates with its other identity, Bauhaus, as an actual physical school. This building was built when it moved. There were 3 locations of the Bauhaus. When it started in 1919, it was in Weimar, and then it moved to Dessau, and here we have the Dessau building. And then finally it ended up in Berlin, which of course would be where you would want to be, given that all of these cities in Germany, excuse me, I should have said that early on. But Berlin in the 1930s, well, I'll let you guess who shut them down in 1933. I'll reveal the answer later in the show. The idea of Bauhaus is that mass production, industry, but mass production as well, does not have to be the enemy of quality. That industry can be used and harnessed, that the machines that you know craftspeople seem to be afraid of can be used, mass production can be used, but used well. It doesn't have to just make junk. There is a way to use these machines for positive and beautiful designs. Walter Gropius was the founder. Here's a photograph of him probably around the time of the founding. And he really motivated this idea. Here's a line of his. Let us therefore create a new guild of craftsmen without the class divisions that raise an arrogant barrier between craftsmen and artists. Let us together desire, conceive, create the new building of the future, which will combine everything into a single form: architecture, sculpture, and painting. There's this idea of totality, of wholeness. Yes, sorry, didn't mean that to happen. There's this idea of wholeness, of a singular vision that could take over all design, meaning from the building to the furniture and the upholstery or the furnishings. Everything about the building can be guided by a singular principle that is basically, although he wouldn't necessarily say this, both beautiful and useful, and that this would produce a harmony in the people using and engaging with these structures, living in these buildings and using these materials, but also that the barrier between art and craft could be erased, and the great strengths of each of these divided forces could be brought together. So for craftspeople, Bauhaus is a fascinating example of how craft and the sort of the guild of craft can be engaged and should be engaged with art and industry in an important and powerful way. Of course, for design, Bauhaus has a massive impact, and we're going to be talking about that. Where their strength was that they combined a sort of really rigorous intellectual theory, and I'm sort of quoting from an important book on the Bauhaus here, in which all of the aspects of a creative experience would have to be learnt and taught through systematically, so that artistic creativity, in which form and color and texture are engaged with material itself, are engaged with the visual experience. So all of this comes together in this whole. So you see here this course of study laid out here. I hope you'll notice that it, in many ways, echoes the course that you're in currently, and hopefully you get that sense, because that's exactly what the people who've designed your course here, your program here rather, have in mind. What we're trying to do is combine all of these aspects, broadly put, combining the material, the aesthetic, and the theoretical all together to provide an education, in a total education in total design. And that, of course, applies whether the student thinks of themselves as an artist, or as a craftsperson, or as a designer, or as anything else that can fall within and around those notions. And so the Bauhaus really pioneers that idea and has a lasting impact everywhere, meaning that it's still a part of the conversations when we have meetings in the craft and design program. We're still discussing themes that the Bauhaus were laying out. Here are some sense of giving you a sense of what the school looked like. There were all sorts of workshops trying to engage all the different pieces of creative output. Everyone had to do everything, basically. You didn't just come in and declare that you were an industrial designer or that you were a ceramist. You had to work through and engage with all the materials. So you would do weaving and you would do painting, even if you were a ceramist, or you wanted to just try to be something more theoretical. And so here you see exactly this in progress. I'll plug my computer in. Ooh, that's trippy. Here are some other examples. We're going to talk about Marianne Brandt in a moment. I'm going to show you a better picture of that. Here's a lamp. I mean, what you're seeing here is this attempt to use industry, to use mechanical processes, but to use them in a way that could still be broadly called craft. Craft not only having to mean sort of the slow way with hand tools, which, I'm not denigrating that for one moment, but the point of Bauhaus was that you can use these methods of mechanization of these industrial processes, but still get a result that has the same qualities, the same care and attention to detail of material, of aesthetics, and of course of function as well. Yeah, here's Marianne Brandt. Here's a picture with her her teapot. This maybe one of her more famous objects, trying to again embody some of the notions that we see carried over all the way through in terms of honesty of material, but now with this very much modernist approach, this new look, this new approach to design. And she became the head of metal in 1928. One of the more famous objects to come out of Bauhaus was this chair, and it's what we see here is a iconic chair that, of course, we now see knocked off and reproduced in many various ways. There's the less expensive versions that you can get for whatever it is, $600 or $700. There's the super expensive, apparently non-replica truth to the original that's several $1,000s. Here's the original, and just a note, just for those keeping score, those are cloth straps. Although we're familiar with the Vasily chair as being, or the B3, as being leather, that's how we see it produced today. Those are cloth. Originally, Broa's chair was cloth. What is most important about this, however, is the bent metal tubing. And what Brouwer did in thinking about chairs and approaching furniture and trying to challenge the ways that furniture was made and thought of, including these industrial processes in the designing, was to take metal tubing and bend it. And of course, we see metal tubing all sorts of different ways, and we see it around us everywhere today. Again, if we were sitting in the lecture hall at Sheridan, I would point out that the chairs we're sitting in probably have bent metal tubing. All of this coming from the place that the Bauhaus was strongest, combining this spirit of intellectual pursuit, of exploring, of not just creating things that had been created before or doing new versions of it, but trying to do something brand new, using what artists call, that sort of inspiration, this ingenio, if you like, but instead of turning it into a painting, turning it into something that can be used. In this instance, a chair. All the way through, the material is important, and so what we're seeing here is in so many of the images you see of a Bauhaus, especially the most important Bauhaus instructors and the figures present in Bauhaus. This is Marcel Brouwer, early days and later days. Is they have their hands up, they have their hands shown. This meaning several different things, but all of it connected to a concept we might think of as craft. Honesty to materials, engagement of the human being with the work of art. I don't have to point out that hand that we saw from the Chauvet cave is the same hand that we're seeing here, that I made this. So even when we talk about Bauhaus objects in terms of this sort of clean, mechanistic, kind of industrial feel, and it's very beautiful in its sterility, if you like, and that's why I picked these glass containers from Wagenfeld, because they do sort of embody that so well. The emphasis is on material. They're made of glass because wood or ceramic or, I don't know, steel wouldn't have made sense in the same way that glass does for these objects. And so this picture, these repeated ideas of hands, is an emphasis of that. And what I want to introduce finally here is one of the most important, one of the many important designers that came through Bauhaus, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, whose idea is represented up here at the top. Design is not an independent entity. The idea is, again, growing out of the Bauhaus, this is Bauhaus, that the designer must be everywhere, in the core and the periphery, the immediate and the ultimate. I love that. This line, you'll hear it again. I teach a course later on in your program, and I'll emphasize this, the idea of the special job in a complex whole. This is Moholy-Nagy, and there he is with his hand, exactly as I just described it, combining all of these various aspects. Moholy-Nagy was he was a photographer. He did these kind of crazy photo montage pictures. He did actual painting. He did sort of what we would call art in its small, limited sense. He did graphic design. He did the design on many of the most famous Bauhaus posters. He did other things like set design for theater, but he also engaged very much with the design principles, the theory behind the Bauhaus and behind its kind of motivating features. So just to go back, sorry, this book here, Vision in Motion, is a fascinating embodiment of all of those principles. One of the final characters, or rather the final character that I'm going to introduce, although there were many others who were important in the Bauhaus, is Mies. Mies van der Rohe, we know really only specifically as an architect, and that's what he was. He was an architect, but he was involved with Bauhaus. He led the Bauhaus for a little while. If I'm not mistaken, he was the head when the Nazis shut them down in 1933. Yeah, there we are. Spoiler. It was the Nazis. Quelle surprise. Anyone having a good time, the Nazis are going to shut you down. And I think Mies was head there. You want to look that up because I may be making a mistake there. But he was head of the Bauhaus at a certain point. and uh, famous for absolute modernist buildings. If you want a definition of a modernist building, go find a Mies van der Rohe building. Here is an example: the Farnsworth House, and this is exterior and interior. It has an almost temporary feeling to it. The use of steel, absolutely honest and clear in its use of materials. Um, Mies van der Rohe is known for some of the cliches of design. God is in the details is one of his. Less is more is one of his. And you can sort of see what that means. And we're going to talk about that in a second, and that is Mies. But I also want to emphasize this quote here. Architecture starts when you carefully put two bricks together. There it begins. There's a story about Mies in his early years when he moved to America. The Nazis basically chased out so many people who were able to see what was coming, got to America, other places too, but especially America. And Mies went there and set up an architecture school as well as an architecture firm. And he was fairly famous. He was well known by that point, and so students came flocking to him to learn all about modernism and make these very straight line buildings out of steel and glass. And what would happen is on their first day, they'd come into class all eager to do this super modernist geometry, and he'd point to a pile of bricks, and he'd say that we're going to spend the first 6 months there. And apparently they were all sort of horrified, because for them the thought of even touching a brick would be just appalling. Why? They were going to be designers, they were going to be architects, they would have nothing to do with the materials. They would draw up their plans in an office somewhere and then hand them off to someone to go and build them. That was to them, and that is often what is thought of. That's what design is. That's what architecture is. But for me, that was an absolute sacrilege. Sure, you were going to do the designs. You were going to be in charge, and there's a great deal of that kind of artist genius in Mies's thinking, especially about himself, but about the role of the architect as well. But it's rooted in material. So again, to come back to it, the Bauhaus belief in materiality that is exactly the same as the William Morris belief in materiality is highly present in Mies. He's talking about bricks there, but whether we're talking about bricks or this rare stone or the marble there or the way the steel pillars work or the way the roof is put together, especially the way the steel and glass is put together in this what comes to be called the international style. This is absolutely honest. There's no hiding what this building is made of. It's made out of I-beams. You can literally see the eye of it, the letter I, in the I-beams if you come close enough to these buildings, with pieces of glass holding up. Now I picked the buildings from the TD Towers downtown in central Toronto. Next time you're in downtown Toronto, if we're ever allowed to get out in public again, go and have a look at these buildings. Two of them are kind of original Mies buildings, if you like, and that's what I'm showing you here. The low one, sorry, I guess it's three. The low one, this one, and the one next to it are kind of original Mies buildings. Two further ones were added, sort of with his blessing, but he wasn't directly involved with the architecture of them. But you'll see they're very similar. But for the architecture design junkies out there, if you want to have a little bit of fun, go lie where the cows are there in downtown Toronto and pick out the points that show you where the difference is, how you can tell the difference between the original Mies building and the follow-up buildings in Mies style. It's very interesting and very informative, not something I'm going to spend time on today. The point that I'm coming to, and I'm going to stop soon because I've gone longer than I meant to, is that although this modernist style is absolutely reduced, it has that geometric abstraction, that attempt at universal clarity that De Stijl, that Van Doesburg and Mondrian were talking about. It has an engagement with the industrial, with that sort of mechanism, metal especially, and that mechanical way of treating materials and turning them into products that are useful. And if they're ever beautiful, well, who cares? They have to be useful. This modernist style is still so deeply engaged with those original notions of beauty and utility. Sure, you can say that these are ugly buildings, they're just useful, they're just straight lines, but not when you actually look at them. They have an amazing, impressive beauty about them. Now, the knockoff buildings, which downtown Toronto and everywhere else it subsequently fills itself with. Those are not necessarily beautiful. Maybe sometimes they are. Maybe they have some beauty to them. But when they're not designed well, they don't have that same quality of beauty. And that's the point that I've been trying to make over the last couple of lectures. One of the points I've been trying to make is that design now has an ability to address and engage with beauty in a way that is facilitated by this craft-related obsession and interest in materials. So Mies van der Rohe, they're building these incredibly powerful, dominating buildings with this rigorous geometry out of material and glorying in the material. Look into Mies. Look at his Seagram building in New York City, which looks very similar to this, very, very much in the same style. And what comes to be called this international style. Mies was not the only international style architect. The one in New York, the Seagram building, that's bronze. He made a building out of bronze, for goodness sake, because he wanted it to look slightly more impressive than the steel that he was used to working with. There's two buildings here, several buildings in Chicago, but the two buildings on Lakeshore Drive that are apartment buildings, again, very similar to this style, slightly less tall, but slightly more interesting in a sense. Have a look at those online. But while the style and the design seems to just be mechanical and industrial, which it also is, it also has an engagement with this beauty, this notion of beauty that I've been talking about, that is vested in craft principles. Now, the final person to talk about, also very much in the industrial style, is Le Corbusier. Now, Le Corbusier is a complex character, and of course, being French always sort of throws things off a little bit. The French have a remarkable way of making everything theoretical in a different kind of way. I'm doing a lot of French philosophy reading right now, so not in French, but from French philosophers. So I'm getting really caught up in some of these ideas. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that next week. Again, talk to Gord if you want to talk about crazy French philosophers. But the way they theorize in France just is slightly different from anywhere else. And so the Corbusier style, it draws from exactly the same place as Mies and Gropius, but does something slightly different. It's got a slightly more organic take. And this is his one of Villa Savoye. That's one of his kind of most famous buildings. That is an attempt to embody his 5 points of architecture. And I won't run through them necessarily, but they are to do with function and where the load, how the load-bearing elements are placed, and how windows should be placed, and how facades should be used, thinking in terms of skin. And not to be constrained by any of the load-bearing necessities. Anyway, look into it if you want to read something interesting. If you're into architecture, then Le Corbusier's 5 points of architecture certainly worth perusing, and they're certainly embodied here. Corbusier is known for many things. He was employed or engaged by the Indian government in the 1950s to basically design a new city, and that was going to be built from the ground up. These are two buildings. This one is a detail of the Palace of Justice here, and this was not only building planning, but it was urban planning. And so Le Corbusier got really carried away and engaged with how to design a city in a way that was both human and rational and organized. And so it's a fascinating. Just reading about Chandigarh is a fascinating adventure in human creativity, in the possibility of science and rationality and mathematics and logic applied to a human situation. And of course, there are tremendous failures in Le Corbusier's projects, even in his individual buildings, but certainly in this laid out city. But there are also tremendous successes. And that ultimately is the point that I'd want to take away from Le Corbusier, and also from the international style more generally, and ultimately from the Bauhaus movement. And I'll come back to the Bauhaus in a second. The idea of function is not necessarily the most functional, and problems arise when they try to adhere to all the different principles that they've laid out. Um, and you can't do that. You can't make a building uh, that is rational and logical and thought out ahead of time and planned, and also organic and human and messy. And so the complaint, if you read about Le Corbusier, the complaint with him is sort of basically housed in this, in his own quote, a house is a machine to live in. Well, in many ways, that's exactly right. If you think of the house as a machine with working parts that should be moved around but should be in the right place, that's a really interesting way to think about a house. There's no point, putting a kitchen sink in your living room, unless actually that may be a great idea if you got a bar in there. But you know what I'm saying. You have to make intelligent decisions. Things have to go in the right place. So Le Corbusier's idea here is that you got, each element is a cog, and they all have to be in the right place for the machine to work properly. But at the same time, I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily want to think about my house as a machine. I'd far rather think of my house as, I don't know, right now it seems like a bit of a jungle in here, but something that has something more organic and living inside it. And so those are the complaints about Le Corbusier, about the international style, and ultimately about the Bauhaus as well. And it comes to this, and this will be where I pick up next week. The design, the attempt to be both beautiful and useful, to engage industry, but to try to adhere to craftsman's values, to be true to material, but to also do it at a cost that is practical for the producer, and that's a big thing we haven't even talked about yet, but that we will come to. All of these issues are being wrestled with, and that's what the Bauhaus has been was wrestling with, and that's what the people working around the Bauhaus subsequently were wrestling with as well. They're trying to take the ideas from Die Stil, which bring with them ideas from arts and crafts and other things. However much they're rebelling against things, they're still all working with these various ideas, and they turn it into a design style that has great success and, more importantly, as we see in front of us, great impact on the future. What I'm going to do now is stop there. I have a lot more. You see, I kind of stopped in mid-sentence there, but it's time for me to stop. I'll stop there, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link of a film about the Bauhaus. I encourage you to watch it. It's a proper film, like not, I didn't make it or something. It's actually a well-made documentary. I think it's about 45 minutes long, and it's about Bauhaus. It'll go into much greater detail, and it's put together by experts, far greater experts than I on Bauhaus, and of course show you many more interesting things about the Bauhaus. I want you to watch that when you're done with this, and then I look forward to speaking to you next week with the last of these lectures.